So the irony of this age is that while Darwin and naturalists like Darwin were emphasizing the commonness of humankind, the commonnesses of the processes that governed our lives in some fundamental way, societies were going about creating national identities that separated us from each other, that claimed that there were some fundamental differences between members of different nations. And these differences, it was increasingly argued, took on the languages of race. And so we see the rise of racial languages associated with the rise of nationalism. In fact, in the 19th century, it's very hard to separate out the language of race from the language of nationalism. Well, the 19th century was the century that sees the advent of new nationalist ideologies. We saw them emerge as a response to the events of the revolutions of the 18th century, 1776, and spreading even more with the advent of new icons of political authority, icons like Napoleon. And so increasingly political leaders will, in a sense, to embody the nation itself, will emulate the figure of Napoleon as national heroes. Well, Napoleon would emerge as the great figure for 19th century nation builders, for Egypt under Muhammad Ali, for Greeks, even for the vestiges of Mughal authority, borrowing a lot of the iconography of the Napoleonic period. Bolivar in South America, all looking to Napoleon's assertive nation building by state formation as a model. Nation building by state formation. What does that mean? What do I mean when making nations requires making states? Well, sometimes it's clearer and to make an explanation to show what I am not arguing. In other words, what I am not arguing is that national identities emerge, and from these identities we get new institutions and we call them states. But rather it is the formation of states and the ability of state powers to be deployed to create national identities that is important. So I am rejecting the notion that argues that national identities are rooted somehow in some primordial difference between peoples. For many nationalists of the 19th century, like the pluralist theories of biological differences between people, science explains the advent of nations. Because we are different, we create these communities and we call them nations to protect and husband these different races, now in the language of the nation. Right? Now, these pluralists argued, since our identities go back many generations, if not millennia, it is time to create state structures to defend these nations. So German nationalists or Italian nationalists would often wrap themselves in languages of race, right, to justify the creation of something called Germany or Italy that would have been parceled up into different principalities. Now, what, in a sense, Napoleon was arguing was we have to build a state. And it is from the construction of a state, or what he represented was the idea that construction of a state could generate a nation, rather than our fundamental differences, our national characteristics arising as a result of national stereotypes. So Germans are martial, Americans believe in liberty for everyone. The Japanese are loyal to their emperor. Rather, the people who argue for state formation as a condition for the nation don't believe necessarily in these essential differences. Rather, they argue that these stereotypes are themselves the constructions of state power. They don't construct state power. So I hope it's clear enough to you what I think about some of these national stereotypes, that they are themselves historical constructs, very often of the 19th century. So these national stereotypes are the products of the 19th century, and they're the products of people trying to advertise, trying to market, trying to propagate, especially through state powers, this idea of the nation. As a response to the challenge of creating political communities out of societies that are mixed races, mixed religions, and mixed peoples. Right? So in practice, the challenge was how to get people to identify with a new political organization once old structures of monarchies and empires were in decline. This was by no means an easy challenge, as we are dealing very often with mixed communities. This was the legacy of the Baroque worlds we've talked about in earlier lectures. So, the idea of a state to create identities, new national identities, was important. And it requires important political and economic processes as a condition. The big challenge for nation building was creating a sense of common homogeneous community to replace those multiple communities of religions, faiths, peoples, and languages within single entities that in fact used to be once called empires: Habsburg Empire, Mughal Empire, Qing Empire, and so on. So, trying to get out of the multiple identities of empires, single identities. Out of local identities that varied from village to village, the creation of national identities. So national integration. This was the purpose of state power in the 19th century. And it required three conditions. The first was that you had to have a strong state. That states make nations, not the other way around. And a strong state could be defined by its military power, by its ability to produce public education systems. So the 19th century is the century that we see the dawning of popular mass public education systems, to propagate new concepts of civic ideals, the birth of new national histories. The 19th century booming industry in writing textbooks for courses in these new public education systems that will be the histories of things called nations that didn't exist before the 19th century, that will roll back into time to search for those primordial origins. What required the state to create these institutions that would do this cultural work, to create an image of a shared past based on some collective experience, and of course projecting a common destiny. Oftentimes proclaiming along the way some underlying argument for racial superiority. One other important complement to this process of using the military power, using education, was the expansion of the franchise. Over the course of the 19th century, the vote was a very important civic exercise on the part of members of these nation states to cast ballots proclaiming their secular faith in these new models of national authority, to give legitimacy to these new regimes called nation states. Well, and of course, who's going to defend voting systems but states themselves? So state power and the bargains that states are striking with their people was very important. To serve in the military, to go to school, and to cast your ballot. State power, number one. Number two, communication systems, especially the press. Disseminating visions of state authority and national identity among these plural communities. And there's a reason why I'm having Napoleon up on the board here, and we're going to see, let me just digress briefly, we're going to see how important images are in global history for creating identity. Right? And we will see the proliferation of newspapers, magazines, eventually the radio, television, yes, the internet, is as instruments for creating identities. Now, in the case of the 19th century, these instruments, particularly the press revolution and the spread of the marketplace for the consumption of images, will be very important for creating national identities. And authors, in fact, will begin to make money by being writers. This is something new in the 19th century. Already very different from the book revolution of the 18th century with the Wealth of Nations and the encyclopédie that we've talked about in an earlier lecture. The idea of this communications revolution is to create a sense of horizontal comradeship of fellow readers, reading the national news to create and spread the idea of the nation. And this is one of the reasons why, again, to reiterate, I press upon you all the history of books and the history of the press. They're connected to the imagination. So, we have the power of the state, the power of communications, and thirdly, the power of transportation. And this is where steam, canals, and of course railroads function very importantly as instruments to connect up parts of societies that were once previously disarticulated or disconnected from each other. Suddenly we can travel from village to village or from town to country with much more facility. In fact, what railroads will often do is integrate a society into something called a national marketplace. So what all three of these do, state power, communication, transportation, do, is integrate the spatial parts of something new, something called a nation. So let's pause here and ask ourselves about the role that states play in developing these new national identities.